She stood in the back of the auditorium wearing a plain denim jacket and canvas shoes, clutching her notepad to her chest as hundreds of people swarmed the entry doors. It was the National Music Conference, held only once a year, and this time it was in her hometown. Most of the crowd had come to see one person, Cameron Vega, the Grammy-winning singer-songwriter who filled stadiums and sold millions of records. His face was plastered on every banner. His voice echoed through the speakers during soundcheck. It was his world, and Lila James was only borrowing a seat in it. As students filed in for the open audition session, many of them laughed, posed for pictures, and practiced scales. Lila remained silent, fingers nervously tracing the corners of her notebook. She had been born deaf, not partially, entirely. No cochlear implant, no corrective surgery, no miracle fix, just silence. But inside that silence, she had learned to feel vibration, to read expressions, and to memorize pitch through sight alone. Years of training, relentless practice, and a stubborn refusal to believe she did not belong had led her here, to this moment. Her parents had saved for over 2 years just to get her enrolled in this conference, and while her teachers admired her talent, many had gently tried to steer her toward composition or technical work behind the scenes. But Lila wanted more than backstage work. She wanted to stand in the spotlight, to be heard not just with ears, but with hearts. She had memorized the music for her song down to the second, studied every rise and fall in the melody, practiced breath control in silence, relying on mirrors and metronomes. When her number was finally called, she stood and walked slowly to the front. Some students smirked. One girl whispered, "Is she lost?" But Lila kept walking. She stepped onto the stage and adjusted the microphone, then looked out at the sea of strangers, some barely paying attention. Cameron Vega sat in the middle of the judging panel, legs crossed, sunglasses still on, arms folded like he already knew what he would say. One of the junior coordinators leaned in to whisper something to him. He looked up, took one look at Lila, then chuckled. "What's this?" he said loudly. "Someone's idea of performance art? Or are we just letting anyone up here now?" Laughter spread like spilled ink. Lila's throat tightened, but she did not waver. She handed the technician her USB drive, gave a polite nod, and waited. The technician hit play. A soft piano began to roll across the room. Lila closed her eyes for a moment and centered herself. Then she began to sing. No microphone, no auto-tune, no safety net, just her voice. Her tone was pure, steady, emotionally raw. Her hands moved gracefully in American Sign Language, translating every lyric into poetry of motion. The room stilled. The chuckles died instantly. Even those with phones in their hands slowly lowered them. Each note she hit was perfect, not just technically, but emotionally. She sang like someone who had lived inside the song, not just rehearsed it. Cameron Vega's smile slowly faded. He leaned forward, removing his sunglasses. There was something disarming about what he was seeing. A girl who had no business reaching pitch with such precision, doing it better than half the professionals he knew. Lila's voice carried the weight of someone who had to fight to be understood every single day, and as she reached the chorus, her vibrato was flawless. Her hands signed the lyrics about overcoming darkness, about finding a voice even when no one was listening. The song ended not with a flourish, but a gentle close that hung in the air like a prayer. No one clapped at first. They were too stunned. And then a single pair of hands started to applaud, then another, and another. Soon the entire auditorium was on their feet, everyone but Cameron Vega. He remained seated, arms now resting on the table, gaze fixed. Lila gave a small bow, then stepped away from the microphone. She picked up her notebook and walked off stage the same way she had entered, quietly, without fanfare. Backstage, a few staffers congratulated her. One judge followed her to ask about her training, but Lila only smiled and signed thank you. She knew what had just happened. She had not just auditioned. She had changed the air in the room. Cameron Vega exited shortly after, not saying a word. Later that evening, at the closed-door judges' meeting, a debate erupted over who had the strongest audition. Several judges nominated Lila. One of them said she should receive the scholarship outright. Cameron finally spoke up. "She cannot even hear music," he said. "She mimicked. It was impressive, sure, but is it real artistry?" A long pause followed. Then another judge spoke. "If she mimicked, then she mimicked with more soul than half this room. And that says something. Cameron did not reply. He simply stood and left the room. That night, Lila sat at her kitchen table, unaware of the debate her performance had sparked. She simply wrote in her journal and ate a bowl of cereal. She had done what she came to do, and for her, that was enough, for now. The next morning, news of the performance had already begun to ripple through the conference. Social media posts from audience members described the moment as breathtaking. Someone had recorded part of her performance and uploaded it, and by noon, the video had already been shared over 10,000 times. The caption read, "She cannot hear a single note, but she sings with more emotion than anyone I have ever heard." But while the online world buzzed, Lila remained unaware. She did not use social media. Her parents had always been cautious about her exposure, especially after a childhood filled with doctors, specialists, and curious stares. Instead, she was spending her day attending workshops, taking notes, and practicing for the second round of auditions. She sat alone during lunch, head down in a music theory workbook, quietly mouthing the rhythm of triplets and key changes. It was not until a fellow student named Joy approached her that she realized something had shifted. "You are the girl who sang yesterday, right?" Joy asked, signing along with her words for clarity. Lila nodded. Joy grinned. "You are all over the internet. People are saying you made the whole room cry." Lila blinked, startled. She had not expected anything like that. But before she could respond, an announcement came over the loudspeakers calling all contestants to the main hall. Something had changed in the program schedule. Lila followed the crowd, unsure what to expect. As she entered the hall, she noticed more cameras than before, more staff, and the judges seated in the front row instead of on the panel. Someone whispered that a surprise masterclass was about to happen. Cameron Vega was taking the stage. He walked out with his trademark slow confidence, microphone in hand, sunglasses returned to their rightful place. The crowd erupted in applause. He let the silence settle before speaking. "I saw something yesterday that caught me off guard," he said. "A performance that challenged my understanding of what it means to create music." Whispers fluttered through the crowd. Lila looked up from her notebook. "So today," he continued, "we are going to do something different. I want to invite that performer back on stage. Lila James, come on up here." Every head turned. Lila froze. Her heart pounded in her chest. People around her nudged her gently. A few clapped. Slowly she stood and walked forward. Cameron waited as she climbed the steps and joined him on stage. "I said some things yesterday," he continued, "that were unfair. I made assumptions, and I was wrong." The audience was quiet now, hanging on every word. "Lila, would you be willing to sing again?" he asked. "But this time, I want to accompany you." Lila hesitated, startled by the offer. She had not rehearsed with anyone, but she nodded. Cameron gestured to a piano that had been wheeled out earlier. He sat at the bench, adjusted the microphone, and looked at her. "Same song?" She nodded again. Cameron played the opening chords. Lila stepped forward, her fingers already moving in sign, her breath steady. She sang, and the room once again hushed. This time, however, there was a new layer to the performance. Cameron's accompaniment was subtle, intuitive, and more delicate than anything he had played in years. He matched her rhythm perfectly, letting her lead. When she reached the chorus, he softened his notes, almost disappearing beneath her voice. And when the final lyric floated through the hall, Cameron lifted his hands off the keys and looked at her, not with pity, but with something closer to respect. The room erupted once again, even louder than the day before. And this time, Cameron stood too. He applauded her, the first on his feet. Lila turned toward the audience and gave another small bow. She did not know what was coming next, but something had shifted. She felt it in the air. Afterward, a panel of judges approached her backstage. Several music schools extended informal offers. A vocal coach from Nashville asked if she had considered recording. A foundation representative invited her to speak at a youth arts event. And Cameron? He found her in the hallway a few minutes later, holding a handwritten note. "I am not good at apologies," he said, "but I am trying." She read it slowly, then smiled. "Thank you," she signed. He nodded, then asked quietly, "Would you ever consider performing at one of my shows?" Her eyes widened. She had dreamed of singing professionally, but not like that. "You would let me open?" She signed. I would let you close, he said, because after you sing, I do not think anyone wants to hear from me. They laughed together, just for a moment, like two musicians who finally saw each other beyond all the noise. That night, as Lila sat in bed, she replayed everything in her mind: the jeers, the silence, the ovation, the piano, the unexpected kindness. But what stayed with her most was not the applause or the offers. It was the realization that she did not need to hear the world to change it. She only needed them to listen. 3 weeks later, Lila stood behind the thick velvet curtain of a sold-out theater in Chicago, her hands clenched around the same notebook she had carried on her first day at the music conference. It was heavier now, filled with new pages, handwritten lyrics, and voice exercise notes she had collected from vocal coaches in the days since. Her life had changed in a matter of days. First the conference, then the video going viral, then the offer from Cameron Vega to join him on a limited city tour. He had insisted on introducing her as the final act, a gesture she still did not fully understand until she experienced her first rehearsal with his team. They gave her a personal interpreter, a vocal consultant, and full creative freedom. Sing the way you always have, Cameron had told her backstage. They will adjust to you, not the other way around. And they had. The sound engineers watched her body language. The lighting team followed her sign movements. The band respected her timing. For the first time, Lila was not the one adapting to the world around her. The world had begun to shift toward her. Now, as the final act approached, her name appeared on the screen above the stage. A hush fell over the theater. Cameron gave her a small nod from the wings. "They are ready for you," he said. Lila took a breath, nodded, and stepped into the light. The theater did not erupt. It did not need to. What came was something more sacred than noise, a silence born from reverence. She walked across the stage, placed her notebook down on the piano bench, and turned toward the audience. The spotlight was warm on her face. Her interpreter stood discreetly to the side, ready if needed, but Lila had insisted on speaking for herself tonight. She raised her hands and signed her introduction while speaking it, voice steady and clear. "My name is Lila James. I was born deaf, but I have always heard music, in my own way." Then she turned, gave a small nod to the band, and waited for the first note. The music began. Soft, sweeping, familiar. Her signature piece, the one that had silenced the conference hall and changed her life. But this version was richer, fuller, tailored to her voice with a swelling bridge and a more delicate close. She began to sing. Every note fell exactly where it belonged. Every breath matched the rhythm. Her hands moved in fluid sign language, interpreting the emotion of each lyric with grace. By the second verse, tears were already streaming down the cheeks of audience members. The song had no gimmicks, no background dancers, no flashing lights, just a girl who could not hear a single note and still moved the world with her voice. When the last lyric passed her lips, the lights faded. Complete darkness, silence, then an explosion of applause that lasted over a minute. Cameron joined her on stage, holding a single white flower. He handed it to her, took her hand, and raised it high. Together, they took a bow. Cameras flashed, fans stood, and backstage, music agents whispered to each other about future contracts, booking possibilities, and streaming deals. But Lila was not listening to any of that. She was listening to something else, the stillness in her chest, the warmth of a song fully expressed. Later that night, she sat by the stage exit, her canvas shoes dangling over the back step, notebook open in her lap. Cameron walked up beside her, still wearing his performance jacket, but now carrying 2 mugs of hot tea. He handed one to her, sat down, and looked out at the empty alley beyond the loading dock. "You know," he said after a pause, "the first time I saw you, I thought you were going to waste everyone's time." Lila looked at him, amused. He smiled. "I was wrong. Completely. I have not seen someone shake a room like that since, well, ever." She wrote something in her notebook, then held it up for him. "Why did you ask me to close?" He nodded slowly. "Because you do what I try to do. You reach people. But when you do it, it feels like the truth, not a performance." They sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence that did not need filling. Then Cameron added, "There is a girl in the front row of every show who is going to remember you for the rest of her life. because you looked like her, or sounded like her, or struggled like her, and she saw you take this stage and own it. Lila smiled and took a sip of tea. I used to wonder, she signed and spoke at once, what music really sounded like. Now I think I know. It is not what you hear. It is what you feel. Cameron nodded. You have got that right. The tour continued for 6 more cities. In each one, Lila closed the show. In each one, she added a few new words to her notebook. Sometimes they were names, sometimes single lines that came to her after a performance. In Denver, she wrote down, "Find the feeling, let it lead." In Dallas, she scribbled, "Do not translate, transmit." And in San Francisco, she added a new lyric to the last page of her songbook, a lyric she had not yet sung out loud, "Even in silence I bloom." By the end of the tour, Lila was no longer just the deaf girl who sang. She was being hailed by music critics as a transformative voice. Her first single climbed to the top 50 within weeks of release, but she turned down several major label contracts, preferring to keep her creative control. She did not want to become a brand. She wanted to remain a message. She donated proceeds from her first concert to a nonprofit that supplied musical instruments to children with hearing loss. She launched workshops teaching others how to find their sound through breath, vibration, and movement. The world wanted her to be a symbol, but Lila just wanted to sing. 6 months after the final tour stop, Lila stood inside a small community auditorium back in her hometown. The place looked nothing like the grand theaters she had performed in. Folding chairs lined up in uneven rows, faded murals on the walls, a dusty baby grand piano in the corner. But to her, it felt sacred. This was where she had first sung for her speech therapist at age 10, where her mother had hosted a fundraiser for her school's music program, where Lila had spent Saturday afternoons scribbling lyrics in the margins of hand-me-down sheet music. She was back now not for fame or performance, but for something simpler, a free workshop open to all, titled Sing Your Silence. It was the first time she had hosted her own event, and while the guest list was small, 30 students, 5 instructors, and a few curious neighbors, every face felt important. Some attendees were deaf like her, others were hearing children with confidence issues. One teenage boy had never spoken in public before. Another girl communicated only through signs. Lila stood in front of them not as a celebrity, but as someone who knew what it meant to be unsure, to be told no, to be underestimated. She began the class with the same sentence every time. "You do not need sound to be heard." Then she asked each student to hum, just hum. Not speak, not shout, not even sing. Just hum, whatever they felt. Some of the students were hesitant. Others burst into soft melody right away. One boy started to cry when he realized his voice vibrated against his chest the same way the piano keys did. Lila sat beside him and hummed with him until he smiled. The local press covered the story. A journalist from a national outlet happened to see it and wrote a feature piece titled, "The Girl Who Taught Music Without Sound." That article made its way to a producer at a major television network. Soon Lila was invited to speak on a morning show. She wore her usual denim jacket, paired now with a soft blue dress and a silver pin in the shape of a treble clef. The host smiled warmly. "Lila, you have become an icon to so many, especially those in the deaf community. What does all this feel like for you?" Lila thought for a moment, then replied, "It feels like someone finally opened a door I have been knocking on my whole life." The audience clapped, but even during interviews, photo shoots, and meet and greets, she kept her notebook with her. It was no longer just for lyrics or reminders. It had become a kind of map. One page held a thank you note to her parents. Another had Cameron Vega's original apology folded and tucked into it. But most of it was filled with phrases she heard or signed or dreamed, lines she might someday turn into songs. Some people measure success by sound. I measure it by stillness. The loudest voices are not always the clearest. Let no one tune you out. It was during one of her workshops in New York City that she met a girl named Neela, 8 years old. Curly hair, bright eyes, profoundly deaf since birth. Her mother had brought her after seeing Lila's performance online. At first, Neela refused to join the group. She clung to her mother's coat and watched silently from the corner. Lila noticed immediately. During a break, she walked over, knelt down, and signed, "Can I show you something?" Neela hesitated, then nodded. Lila brought her to the center of the room where the piano waited. She pressed one key softly. Neela blinked. Then Lila placed the child's hand against the wood and played the chord again. Neela's face changed. She felt it. The vibration, the movement, the pulse. Lila pressed another, and another. Then signed, "That is your heartbeat's cousin." Neela laughed. The next day, Neela returned with a ribbon in her hair and a page of hand-drawn notes. She sang, not with sound, but with motion, with rhythm, with wide expressive signs that danced in the air. By the end of the week, she stood before the group and signed her very first song. And when the final word floated through her fingers, she pointed at Lila and signed, "Thank you for hearing me." Lila felt her throat tighten. She stepped forward, hugged the girl, and whispered, "I did not hear you. I felt you. That is better." Stories like Neela's became common. Parents reached out from around the country. Teachers requested classroom visits. Universities asked Lila to speak on music accessibility. Still, she refused to let her schedule turn her into someone unreachable. She answered emails herself. She read every message. Once a week, she went completely offline and walked to the park where she had first sung to the trees as a child, letting the wind carry her silence. That silence, once a cage, had become her stage. Cameron Vega continued to tour, often inviting Lila to join him for special encore appearances. But their relationship had changed. They were no longer mentor and student. They were collaborators. He once told a journalist, "She reminds me why I started. She sings like the world depends on it." And maybe it did, because for people like Neela and thousands like her, Lila James had become more than a voice. She had become proof. Proof that what makes you different is not what disqualifies you. It is what defines you. She had been mocked, dismissed, laughed at, but in the end, she had sung, and the world had listened. 1 year later, Lila was standing in front of the United Nations building in New York City. It was early spring, and flags from around the world fluttered in a soft wind that smelled faintly of rain. She was not here to perform. She had been invited to speak. The International Day of Persons with Disabilities was being commemorated with a full-day summit, and Lila had been selected as one of the keynote voices. She stood beside ambassadors, policymakers, and scientists, and yet, when she stepped onto the stage, her presence commanded more attention than any formal title. Dressed simply in a navy blouse and white slacks, her long brown hair tied back in a loose braid, she approached the podium holding her notebook and a small audio player. A quiet fell over the room as she opened the notebook, pressed play on the track, and then stood still for a moment. A soft instrumental piece began to play. It was not one of her usual songs. It had no lyrics, just music, simple piano, a heartbeat rhythm beneath it. As it played, she closed her eyes, then began to sign. Not sing, sign, line after line of poetry. Her hands moved with purpose. Her expression shifted with the beat. She had memorized this translation by heart, and by the time the final note faded into silence, more than a few diplomats were dabbing their eyes. Then she stepped up to the microphone, took a breath, and said, "I was told for years that I could not be part of the world of music because I could not hear. But I am here to say there are more ways to listen than through your ears, and more ways to be heard than through your mouth." She went on to speak about access, visibility, the danger of assumptions. She never once raised her voice, but somehow each word struck like thunder. After the speech, the Secretary General approached her personally. A representative from a major education network requested she help design music curriculum for students with disabilities, and a philanthropist offered to fully fund her foundation if she would open more workshops across other countries. But what moved her most came after all the press and ceremony. A woman in her 50s approached shyly, holding a program in one hand and a hearing aid case in the other. She introduced herself as a retired opera singer who had lost her hearing years ago. She signed, "I thought my voice was gone, but you gave it back to me. Thank you." That night, in her hotel room overlooking the city skyline, Lila turned to a new page in her notebook. She wrote only one sentence. "The silence is not empty, it is waiting." Back home, life moved at a slower rhythm. The trees changed colors with the seasons. The streets outside her family's house remained cracked in the same places. And yet, everything was different. She had released her first full-length album, a blend of signed lyrics, vocal harmony, and instrumental storytelling. It reached the top 10 in its second week, not because of flashy marketing or viral dance trends, but because people passed it along like a secret too beautiful to keep. Her fans included children with cochlear implants, teenagers who struggled with social anxiety, elderly folks who had never touched a microphone, and musicians who had fallen in love with sound all over again. The album was called Unspoken. She toured less now, not out of exhaustion but by choice. She had started training other performers to take the spotlight, some deaf, some not, but all committed to creating music that included, not excluded. She founded the Resonance Institute, a nonprofit that provided adaptive instruments, inclusive music education, and emotional support for artists with disabilities. Cameron Vega joined the board of directors and donated the proceeds from one of his stadium tours to the cause. When asked why, he said simply, "Lila helped me hear what I had forgotten. The point of music is not to impress. It is to connect." One afternoon, she visited her old high school. A music teacher she adored had invited her to speak to a class of new students. She walked through the same halls she once tiptoed through, back when she was terrified of being called on to read aloud, back when she used to eat lunch in the library to avoid the stairs. But now, the students greeted her like a hero. They had studied her performances, learned about her process. Some of them had already started experimenting with signed music videos of their own. One girl asked her if she ever wished she could hear like everyone else. Lila smiled gently and replied, "No, because then I might not have listened as deeply as I do now." That night, her former teacher took her out for coffee and told her something that made her sit in stunned silence. "You know your first audition? The one where I let you into choir even though you sang off key that day? I did not do that because I heard potential. I did it because I saw determination. And I was right." They clinked their mugs together, teacher and student, now both mentors in their own way. When she returned home, she opened her notebook again. She drew a small treble clef in the corner of the last filled page, then turned to a fresh one and wrote a new phrase. "This is not the end. It is the echo." 2 years after the conference that changed everything, Lila stood in the center of a quiet recording studio in Nashville. The room was small, cozy, wrapped in wood paneling and lined with acoustic foam. It was not the kind of high-budget space she had once been offered by major labels, but it was hers. Every part of it, from the custom flooring that let her feel vibration more clearly to the lights set low for focus, had been designed for how she created. This was not just a studio, it was a sanctuary, and today, something special was happening. Across the glass in the sound booth stood a group of students from her Resonance Institute. Some of them wore hearing aids, some used sign language. One child had cerebral palsy and communicated entirely through a vocal device. All of them were here to record their first collective single, a song they had written together over 6 weeks of workshops called Inside the Sound. It was about identity, expression, and what it meant to make music when the world never expected you to. Lila stood with them during the final take. She did not sing, she let them lead. She followed their timing. She watched their breathing. She signed the lyrics while the music rolled out into the room like something sacred. And when it ended, the engineer pressed the talk button from the booth and whispered, "That was magic." Afterward, they had a small celebration in the lounge. Juice boxes, homemade cupcakes, printed certificates. Lila gave each student a bound lyric sheet with their names printed inside. Then she gave them something else, a piece of paper with a single sentence on it. "Your voice is not a sound, it is a presence." One girl clutched the paper to her chest like a trophy. Another boy, usually quiet, whispered that this had been the first time he felt like he belonged somewhere. As the sun set and parents arrived to pick up their children, Lila stayed behind to clean up. She stacked empty cups, folded tablecloths, and wiped frosting from the counters. Alone in the studio, she stood for a moment in the center of the room, listening to the silence. It was a kind of silence that did not demand anything from her. Not performance, not perfection, not apology. Just presence. She smiled, then walked to her notebook resting on the piano bench and wrote down one more line. Let others chase volume. I will chase resonance. That fall, she received an invitation she never expected. The National Conservatory of Music had created a new honorary fellowship. It was called the Echo Award. It was reserved for musicians who had redefined how sound, art, and connection were understood. She would be the first recipient. When she arrived at the ceremony held in a modest hall on the edge of the university campus, she found herself walking past portraits of classical composers whose names she had studied for years. Bach, Mozart, Ellington, Armstrong, all men, all hearing. But that night, a new portrait was unveiled. It was not painted in the traditional style. It showed her mid-performance, hands mid-air, mouth open in song, eyes lit with something stronger than applause. Below it was engraved a line taken from her first album, Even in Silence, I Bloom. The audience stood in ovation as she walked onto the stage. Professors, students, musicians, journalists, every single one on their feet. She did not speak right away. She waited, looked at each face, then lifted her hands and began to sign. Her interpreter stood beside her, voicing each phrase. I have been told my whole life that I exist in a space between things, between hearing and silence, between sound and gesture, between what music is and what people think it must be. But I am not between anything. I am wholly within. The applause that followed felt less like noise and more like acknowledgement, not of fame, not of accomplishment, but of presence, of truth. After the event, as she mingled with students, one girl approached her, tears in her eyes. She introduced herself as someone who had dropped out of her music program after losing her hearing in an accident. I thought my life was over, she said. I did not think I could ever be part of music again. Then I saw you, and I realized maybe I do not have to give it up. Maybe I just have to redefine it. Lila hugged her tightly. Then you already belong, she whispered. Later that night, in her quiet apartment, Lila lit a single candle and sat by the window. The city lights flickered outside. Somewhere, a distant siren passed, but all she heard was stillness, and inside that stillness was peace. She reached for her notebook. The pages were almost full now, each line a story, each margin a lyric. She turned to a blank one, looked at the empty space, and smiled. Then she wrote, "Some people write music to be heard. I write music to be remembered." And she knew, without doubt, that she had done just that. 3 years after the day she first stepped on stage at the National Music Conference, Lila stood once more in that same auditorium, but this time, she entered through the artist's entrance, not the front lobby. The seats were packed again, though many in the crowd were younger, new students who had grown up watching her videos and learning her songs in music class. Her name was printed in large blue letters on the event banner. Some of the volunteers were too shy to speak to her directly, but she caught them glancing in her direction with admiration and disbelief. She was not here to compete. She was not here to audition. She was here to speak, to open the conference and tell her story, not as a footnote or novelty, but as a foundational truth. She waited in the wings while the organizers finished their introductions. She could feel the hum of the crowd, the rustle of programs, the low buzz of whispered speculation. And then her name echoed through the speakers, and the room quieted completely. She walked out slowly, wearing a soft white blouse, a long skirt, and her familiar denim jacket. No jewelry, no fanfare, just Lila. She placed her notebook gently on the podium and raised her hands to begin. As always, she spoke and signed at the same time, her interpreter standing nearby just in case. 3 years ago, I stood right here. I wore sneakers and a t-shirt and carried this same notebook. I had no idea what would happen when I sang. I only knew that I had to try. The audience was silent, hanging on her words. That performance changed everything, but not because I sang perfectly. It changed things because you listened, and when people listen, things grow. She paused and looked out at the sea of students, many holding notebooks just like hers. Since then, I have sung in concert halls, on street corners, in schools and hospitals and prisons. I have stood beside people who were told they would never be heard, and I have watched them rise. She opened the notebook and began to sing. Not the original song, a new one written only a week ago. A melody about coming home. Her hands moved with the music. Her voice flowed without hesitation. It was a lullaby for the brave, a hymn for the unheard. When the song ended, the lights faded gently, and for a long moment, no one clapped. They were too moved. Then one person stood, then another, until the entire hall was on its feet. Students, teachers, judges, technicians, all of them united by something they had not expected, a performance that went deeper than pitch, louder than sound, stronger than applause. Backstage, the volunteers cried. One boy approached her, tears streaking his cheeks, and signed, "Thank you for showing me I matter." She hugged him, holding his shaking shoulders in her arms, and whispered, "You always did." That night, she stayed long after everyone else had left. She returned to the stage in the dark, placed her hand on the microphone stand, and stood there for several minutes in silence, remembering, honoring the moment that had started it all. Then she picked up her notebook, pressed it to her chest, and walked out the same door she had entered, quietly, but never unnoticed again. 5 months later, Lila received an invitation from an international orchestra based in Vienna. They had composed a symphonic piece inspired by her first viral performance and wanted her to perform it with them for a global broadcast. She accepted, but only on one condition: she would not sing alone. Instead, she asked to bring 5 young performers from her workshops, each with different levels of hearing, to stand alongside her on stage. The orchestra agreed. And so, on a rainy evening in Austria, beneath golden chandeliers and velvet curtains, Lila stood barefoot on the main stage of one of Europe's oldest concert halls. Her students stood beside her, each dressed in black with silver sashes. When the conductor lifted his baton, Lila took one deep breath and the room transformed. Music filled the air, rich, orchestral, layered with strings and horns. But in the center of that vast, powerful sound was something softer, something raw. Lila's voice, pure and steady, rose with grace. Her students signed in perfect unison, their hands dancing with every line. Together, they turned a classical performance into a shared language, something untranslatable, something universal. When it ended, the applause did not stop. Viewers around the world watched from their screens. Critics called it one of the most important performances of the decade. But for Lila, it was not about acclaim. It was about expansion. She had grown the stage, not just for herself, but for others. She had made space where none had been before, and she had done it without changing who she was. After the performance, while cameras rolled backstage and reporters clamored for interviews, Lila stood alone by the green room window. She looked out at the rain and wrote a single sentence in her notebook. "The stage is not a place, it is a promise." The months that followed were a blur of opportunity. New schools adopted her methods. Government grants funded music programs in underserved communities. Celebrities began signing during concerts. She was invited to lead workshops in South Africa, Japan, Brazil, and Turkey. And yet, she kept returning home, to her family, to her neighborhood, to the small community center where it all began. One day, a girl named Mia walked into that center holding her father's hand. She was shy, nearly mute, and clung to a small stuffed bear. Her hearing loss was severe and her confidence nearly invisible. Lila sat with her for 3 hours without forcing a single word. She handed her a small keyboard, placed her hand over the speaker, and waited. When Mia pressed a key and felt the vibration, she giggled. The next week she returned, then again and again. 1 year later, Mia performed her first song in front of 40 people, signed from memory, with Lila standing just off stage. That moment was not broadcast. There were no reporters, but Lila wrote about it in her notebook that night. She sang without fear, and so did I. 10 years after being mocked in a crowded auditorium, Lila stood beside Cameron Vega once more, this time at an award ceremony recognizing their combined work in music accessibility. The room was elegant. Rows of tables dressed in white linen, golden centerpieces, well-dressed attendees from every corner of the music world. When Cameron introduced her, he paused mid-speech and said, "I once thought I knew what a real singer looked like. I was wrong." Then Lila took the stage. She stood there, calm, confident, timeless. She spoke directly to the crowd. "I used to think singing meant having a perfect voice, but now I know it means having something honest to share." Her words hung in the air like a final note. The standing ovation came not as a roar, but as a wave, gentle, powerful, steady. That night, after the event ended, Lila walked alone through the quiet city streets, still wearing her ceremony dress, her shoes in her hand. She stopped at a small bench near the harbor, sat down, and opened a brand new notebook. The first page had been waiting for years. She uncapped her pen and began to write. Once there was a girl who lived in silence. People mistook that for absence. But in the stillness, she found rhythm. In the quiet, she found melody. In rejection, she found resolve. In doubt, she found power. And in herself, she found a voice. She sang, and the world at last fell silent just to hear her. She closed the book, set it in her lap, and looked up at the stars. There was no applause, no cameras, no lights, just Lila, present, whole, listening,